What happens when a man raised on guns, gospel, and grief points a camera at the American soul and pulls the trigger? Jethro Waters is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, cinematographer, and professor. His debut narrative feature, Gunfighter Paradise, is a surreal Southern Gothic dark comedy that has drawn comparisons to the Coen brothers and David Lynch, while carving out a space entirely its own. On today's episode, we dig into the collision of religion, violence, grief, and the great American psychosis, as seen through the lens of one of independent cinema's most fearless new voices. This is the Dark Mind Podcast. If you enjoy the show, please support it by subscribing to my YouTube channel. Your support helps keep the dark conversation alive. So without further ado, I give you Jethro Waters. Jethro, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 11th day of March 2026. I was genuinely intrigued by the trailer for Gunfighter Paradise, and even with the Coen brothers comparisons and a sense of the film's themes going in, I still didn't know quite what to expect. What I found was an absolute surreal journey made possible through stunning cinematography and an abstract narrative that unfolds the way paint finds its own path on a canvas. It's a truly inimitable piece of work, so thank you for making it and joining me on the show today to discuss it.
I'm happy to be here to talk about it, and thank you very much. That was the most eloquent intro I think I've had.
Thank you, sir. Well, so, kind of a brief synopsis. The film is about a man named Stoner, a camouflage-wearing hunter in rural North Carolina, who returns home after his mother's death, only to discover a mysterious suitcase containing roughly $7 million. What begins as a strange inheritance quickly spirals into something far darker as Stoner starts receiving divine visitations, deciphering cryptic riddles his mother left behind, and navigating a world populated by Confederate reenactors, zealous neighbors, and a mummified cat, and a killer with strange proclivities that gets even more bizarre with his smelling habits. And that is where the story begins. So you've called this film an exploration of the American psychosis. When you look at the collision of guns, religion, and grief in the rural South, what is the specific madness you were trying to capture?
I think it's really just the paradox of when you look at folks who are very religious, and it's written in the South, it's based in the South, but I think it applies to all of America, and I think I'm addressing it in mostly a Southern perspective because that's what I know because I'm from the South, but I think it really has to do with all of America. But the specific psychosis for me has to do with what is actually in the Bible and how conservative Christianity has mutated that into kind of this hyper patriotic, pro-violence, pro-bigotry, this really strange version of Christianity, which I wouldn't call Christianity at all. There's been so many times that I've had this conversation, and what I always revert back to is the Sermon on the Mount. I think if anybody who's a Christian reads the Sermon on the Mount, you understand what Christianity is supposed to be about. And that has nothing to do with our current cult of personality and this strange psychosis mutation of violence and religion and spirituality. That's it's just it's a true paradox in the fact that that's where we've ended up with conservative Christianity in the United States, for me.
Yeah, I mean, I was raised in the church. I don't consider myself religious at all right now, but I do know a few people that identify as Christians, and I do like those people because they are, technically the definition of what should be Christ-like. It's weird how I think the book of Romans is often the one that people use, especially the ones associated with those. I guess the best word for them would be re-education camps for gay people to to get out of that sexual orientation, and just numerous other books that they kind of turn inside out to support some pretty dangerous things.
Absolutely, it's kind of shocking, the cherry picking that goes on with what people base their agendas on and how they decide to live their lives, and the idea of letting God, if you're a religious person, and you believe in God, letting God be the ultimate judge. And yet, Christianity, and especially corporate conservative Christianity in this country, is just a big house of judgment, and it's unfortunate. I think it's really sad, because there is a lot of beauty within a lot of religions, and there's a lot of beauty within Christianity. And I do, like you, I know a lot of Christians who are really wonderful people and who do live by the rule of do unto others and love thy neighbor, right? Mm. That's the thing, right? That's what should be up front most, but it's not. They're doing, like you're saying, picking a couple of little issues. And if we cherry picked other things, about the violence that you're supposed to seek on other folks that are in the Bible and all these strange contradictory passages, we'd be living in a very upside down world. And that seems to have happened, especially when it comes to American Christianity.
Yeah, something that just kind of popped into my head as well. The movie's very surreal, very abstract with the way the themes are inserted. The $7 million, does that tie in any way into, as we're talking about cherry picking, the prosperity gospel that like the mega churches kind of push?
Sure. It's definitely set up to be, speaking directly, very literally about greed, and how that dilemma that exists where folks have no issue starting a church as a business and then profiting from it, and there's not a direct correlation between that $7 million in the case and the film with Joel Osteen or any of those fools. But
I'm from Houston. I'm very familiar with that guy.
No, you are the most familiar with that guy. I'm from Austin originally, before North Carolina, so gotcha. I grew up in Austin, and it is a statement about, the ultimate dilemma that we get into when we talk about prosperity and we talk about money. And then you're also, a very religious person. There's a lot of ground to cover, and that is definitely a device in the film.
Yeah. Well, kind of piggybacking off of what we're just talking about, in the movie, Stoner finds $7 million in a suitcase and almost immediately starts hearing from God. What does it say about the American psyche that a man's first response to sudden wealth is a spiritual crisis rather than a material one?
I think, I don't know if this answers your question directly, but I think in a roundabout way, we see so much of the billionaire class and what's going wrong with this country and the world right now based on extreme disparity in wealth, and I think once folks get to, this is what I imagine, because I don't know, because I'm not a billionaire or a millionaire, so, but what I imagine is that you become so detached from the reality of living as a human being in this kind of a normal everyday buy groceries, think about bills, think about money as a thing that you constantly have to monitor and be careful with and live your life in a very specific way. And then once you hit a certain level of wealth, money becomes this abstract thing where it doesn't matter. And if you're sitting on a $300 million yacht, there is no way for someone at that level to relate to a normal human being that's making 40, 50 grand a year or something. It's just, it's not. And so I think, this is definitely going off on a tangent, but I think that's a huge problem, and it's manifesting everywhere. And we see all these people that they get canceled and they do all these crazy things because they become these alien weirdos because they have way too much money. And then they're like, oh, let me revert back and praise Jesus on, Twitter or whatever to get a fan base back and build my reputation back. And they find God somehow after they found, all this money and, wealth that's going to last 7 generations after they're gone. And to me, it's tragic and hilarious that seems to be just verbatim what happens. Someone becomes extremely wealthy, and especially if they're a celebrity, they do something extraordinarily ridiculous, get canceled, get called out for it, and then they're like, actually, you know what? I'm going to reach out, and I've been saved, and please forgive me. And there's little touches of that in the film, but that's not a central theme, I would say. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question at all, but that's just my personal feeling on it.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off what you said about, losing touch with people, millionaires, billionaires. I was really shocked when I heard somebody talking about how the average person doesn't really have a concept of million, billion, and trillion. Like, I won't, spend a lot of time and ask you, guess this, guess that. I'll just, straight up say to you and the listeners at home. So 1 million seconds is 11.57 days. But then you go up to 1 billion, 31.7 years. And then you go up to 1 trillion seconds, we're getting up into our national debt, 31,688 years.
Whoa, prehistory.
It's insane.
That is absolutely,
the fact that we're in that kind of debt.
No, that is mind blowing. I've never heard those figures before. That's a very good way to frame it.
Mm-hmm. Well, your father was a Vietnam veteran and a professional gunsmith, and you were competing in handgun speed shooting by age 12. How did growing up inside that world influence the way you think about masculinity, violence, and control in this film?
It informed it in a way where I wanted to pay respect to that. And there's a lot of reverence in the film that I, embedded in the film that I hoped would come across. And it seems that it is, and a lot of audiences have seemed to dial into the reverence that's paid both to spirituality, to Christianity in some ways, when we have the gospel hymns that are being sung, to the culture of, that I grew up in, which is gun culture, as a sport, hunting, all of those kinds of things, and, I wanted to pay reverence to that and to my dad specifically because I know that I had a very rare situation. And when I said that my dad was terrifying, but he was also extremely loving and kind in the film, that is 100% accurate. My dad we're very close. We've always been very close. He's very conservative, very Christian, very literal. And, we don't have the same beliefs in that sense at all, but we have a very close bond and we're very close. So when I go home, we go to the gun range, when I go visit him, we go shoot, targets, we shoot handguns, we shoot long range rifles. And that's just part of my DNA. That's how I grew up. He also is extraordinarily brutal and strict when it came to gun safety, which I think is something that is very lacking in this country. I grew up in a way where he taught us, my sister and I, very early on, the proper fear that you need to have, because these are tools, instruments of death, right? Even though we're using this as a sport and we're speed shooting and it's fun and it's great, you screw up one time and people die, right? And so, and so by the time I was 5, I was out on a gun range in Texas with him, shooting. I don't remember a time when I wasn't shooting. And so, I have a deep love for that and for hunting and for speed shooting and for all those things. And, but I wanted to paint that in a way to where we show how lethal and how dangerous it is. And it obviously is a massive problem in this country. There's a lot of lunatics. There's more firearms in this country than there are human beings, which is wild. It's a wild thing to imagine, but that's the reality that we live in. And so if in Japan or in Norway or these places where there's very few guns, if any, I wouldn't own firearms because there's not really a need to, right? It's not part of the culture in the country. But in America, this country was won with, with the lever action. The lever action came along, and we won the West essentially, and we massacred the native people and took over this country, and we've been filled. This country has been filled with violence and guns ever since, and that's not a reality that I'm going to deny as an American living here. I'm very thankful I grew up in the way that I did, and the values that my father taught me, and the skills that he taught me, but I think there's a very fine line between being respectful of this violent tool that is everywhere in America, and the fact that there are way too many of them, and way too many lunatics have access to them, and I'm not here to lobby either way, because I can't, because the genie is out of the bottle and it'll never go back in America. It's never going back in the bottle. It's just a reality that we live in. And I wanted to address that in the most balanced way that I could.
Gotcha. Well, kind of still sticking to the subject matter, or this particular line of questioning, the muscle memory you must have from speed shooting. Most filmmakers, I doubt have that. How did that intimacy dictate the way violence actually feels on screen rather than just how it looks? Because, even the scene where you're reloading, is that the term when you reload your own bullets?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
reloading. Yeah.
Yes, that's actually called a reloader. The one, the crank, the lever. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even that is authentic. So.
Yeah, no, I wanted it to feel very sincere, for people who do or are very practiced with firearms, and I wanted it to feel sincere in most ways. And there's plenty of autobiographical stuff, obviously, written into the film, and there's also there's a lot more fiction than there is autobiography. Quite obviously, I've never had a weird killer with a knife stalk me and all those kinds of things. But I did, like you said, I wanted it to feel authentic and feel sincere. And when people who actually really are quite familiar with firearms, when they watch that, they understand this isn't Hollywood. This isn't someone, shooting 700 rounds out of a revolver. This is that it has that feeling to it. And
it's not John Wick.
it's not John Wick. Those are fun movies though, man. Those are entertaining, but you're absolutely right. There's a couple of thousand rounds being shot in every scene, and you're like, wow, that dude carries a lot of ammo around with him.
The gun never jams once.
not once. He's got this thing. He's got a great gunsmith is what he has. But yeah, going back to your point about the muscle memory and filmmaking, I think, we have enough John Wicks, and we have enough of these really explosive action movies where all this stuff is happening. And I grew up loving Rambo and, loving all of the action movies. I grew up on all that stuff. We have enough of that stuff. And so the way the violence is portrayed on screen is very serious. And I wanted to lean into the suggestion of extreme violence rather than directly in your face, giant squibs blowing up and, blood flying all over everybody, these big gunfights, which I kind of think maybe what some people expect going into the movie with a title like that, just kind of what you go in expecting. Rather, it's this, very, very dark satire, that has a very specific pacing and rhythm to it in the film. But yeah, I think I'll say this. I do, and my good friend Burke Uzzle, who's a very, a photographer of my very first film, who's renowned, him and I went to the gun range one time and we practiced, because he would carry, because he had hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment in his van, and he was 78 years old at the time. So he was like, nobody's going to mess with me and steal my equipment. And he's like, I've been around too long in the 1960s to know what America's really about. I'm going to carry. And I was like, okay, man. Anyways, Burke pointed out, and I'd never thought about it. Burke pointed out when we were working together, and it was one of the greatest compliments I've ever received, was you have this Magnum photographer, this guy who's photographed everything, he's, super famous photographer. And he pointed out, he's like, I love the cinematography, and it's really precise and beautiful, all these things. I was like, wow, what better compliment could you possibly get from anybody? And he said, and I think your ability to make films and run solo like this and shoot and think about all the other things that you're doing, definitely has to do with your upbringing from your dad and your ability to concentrate on a competition level, shooting in those high intensity situations when you were, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's definitely informed what you're doing now, not on a direct, correlation with, competition speed shooting and filmmaking as an art. Those are very different things, but in your ability to focus in that way, that had to have had a big impact on you. And I never thought about that. And when Burke said that, a light bulb went off and I was like, man, I need to call my dad and say thank you. And I told him that, and he was like, well, I did my best.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not to go off into the weeds, but just as he mentioned, I mentioned it in the intro, the cinematography. I mean, like me and my wife watched it and we're just blown away by this, what you put on this canvas. I mean, it's so surreal and simultaneously just naturally beautiful when you're panning over the landscape of that area. Just,
I really appreciate that. And it's a testament to just looking at things carefully and looking at times of day, and I tell all my students, yes, I love, using big Mole Richardson lights and all these fancy things that we have, to use false lighting and, sets and all these things. But for me, there's nothing more beautiful than looking for a location that's extremely beautiful, and you wait for the right time of day, and it only happens momentarily. You have to catch it when it's there, and that's really the magic for me, is why, why I love shooting with so much natural light, is because it does come across very differently on screen when you are able to capture those moments, that are very fleeting throughout the day. The light will hit just right for a very short time, and if you catch it, it's a really beautiful thing.
well, critics keep reaching for David Lynch and the Coen brothers when they describe your work. Since this story is rooted in your actual childhood in rural North Carolina, what do those surrealist comparisons miss about the specific psychological texture of that place and those people?
Yeah, I think it's a fun, it's a fun name drop to hear. Of course, you hear somebody name drop Lynch, or the Coen brothers, and without a doubt, subconsciously and consciously, those filmmakers have had a massive influence on me, as they have everybody else. I don't think this is a Lynch film, because there is no other Lynch film. Lynch made his films and he changed cinema forever and made his own art form with cinema. And there's nothing that compares to it, especially not this film. I love those name drops, but this film is very, very different in the surrealist element. I'm a big fan of surrealism. I have been since I was, as soon as I discovered surrealism, as an early teenager, as we usually do. You're like, oh wow, and you see Salvador Dali, and then you start diving into all the different things, and friends give you David Lynch movies and all these things. And my favorite surrealist is Max Ernst. If I've got anything to share about the world of surrealism, Max Ernst is my guy. That's my surrealist. That's the one I love the most. And, but I think what those references might miss is that, David Lynch, everything is up for interpretation. Everything is streamlined. He's, very actively doing things that are up for interpretation to every single viewer in a very magical way, and sometimes a very frustrating way for some people, which is the beauty of it. I think David Lynch is not for everybody, and that's also what I love about his work, is it's not for everybody, and some people just get so frustrated with it, but a lot of people really love it, and I think he did a great service for all of us who really love surrealism, who love magic realism, who love really, fantasy styled films, and that he opened up that world for us to make a lot more within it. I think what is missed a little, in those references, if people think, oh, this is, a David Lynch kind of film, is that, there's very specific messaging in the film. You can derive the basic message of a lot of scenes, even though there's surreal elements and surreal objects and these things happening. And yes, everything is open for interpretation. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of interpretations of what relationships and colors and all of these things mean in the film. And that was another intention. I'm not trying to literally write out for folks what the film means by any means, but I think this film is much more accessible, and you're able to decipher it much more than you would a David Lynch film.
Yeah. Have you've been to Houston, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you ever gone to the Menil collection?
I have not, no.
It's over in the Montrose area. It's this French American couple. The man, I forget what his name was. We'll just say Mr. Manil, came to Houston because he was an oil man, and his wife Dominique was a an art collector. So she had her own gallery basically, and they've long since passed away. So it's kept going by a trust and charitable donations, I think. But I mean, it's a beautiful little spot. And, it kind of triggered my memory of going there when you talked about Max Ernst, because they had a few of his paintings there.
Wow, I'll need to visit it. I try to see his stuff anywhere it shows up.
Mm-hmm. Well, circling back to the movie, and correct me if I'm wrong, you wrote, directed, shot, edited, and scored this film?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, at some point, and this is me speculating, in a project that consuming, exhaustion probably becomes a creative force of its own. Were there decisions you made on this film that only happened because you were too tired to overthink them? And did those turn out to be the right calls?
Very much. I had cast the film in a different way initially. And after the first 2 weeks of shooting, they were working to a certain degree, but the scenes weren't working in the way that I knew they needed to for this film to actually work in the final edit. And so, lots of things happen. You could call it divine intervention. You could call it all kinds of things. I even had, the monitor on my camera, the camera fell over, which has never happened before, and the monitor broke. And I took that as a total sign, because it was the first 2 weeks, and it's like, well, this has never happened before. Something needs to change. And I looked at that and was like, okay, I need to get a new monitor. The camera's fine. Thank goodness. But because of that, the wardrobe changed a little bit. My wife, very astutely, who's also a producer on the film, Sarah, she pointed out, you need to change this makeup a little bit. There was a little bit of brown in it before, and then we switched it to just green and black. And then that clicked. And I was like, that's it. That's the thing. And so we had these 2 weeks of shooting where the main character's, wearing these has a different look, and it didn't really feel right. So anyways, once that monitor broke, I just kind of sat down for a couple of days and re-looked at the script and realized that I had cast these two characters wrong, and the people who were playing them needed to be flipped. These are all my friends, these are all, except for Jessica Hecht, who's amazing, brilliant in everything she's ever done, Broadway, films, television. She's in the film. She's the only professional actor in the film. Everybody else are not our first time actors. And so when I flipped those two people and then had them read as though those two characters, everything clicked. And then we were off. We were done. I knew immediately that needed to happen. Those 2 weeks of shooting needed to happen for us to get a feel and understanding for what this film really needed to be. And these minor little changes that we made ended up being huge and making the film really, really gel. So I was to be honest with you, it sounds strange, but I was very thankful that I broke my monitor on my camera, and I had that time to sit down and think. It was great, that happened, and we got the film that we got.
Well, just to give the viewers an idea of what we're talking about here. So you were saying that this used to include some brown?
Yeah, there was brown, black, and green originally, and the wardrobe was a little bit different. It wasn't as dark and as full of complete camo and black, and it was a little bit brighter than it needed to be. And after we watched that footage back, and Sarah just said, you should just take the brown out of that and just do black and green. And I was like, huh. And then I did that, and then immediately, all of a sudden I was like, why didn't I do that in the first place? Because, I watch Apocalypse Now every year, maybe twice a year. It's one of those few films that I watch every year just because. All of a sudden, kind of the reference of, it's not the same makeup, but there is a similarity in when Martin Sheen comes out of the water, his face paint and that face paint are somewhat similar. And I was just like, oh, this is perfect. This is it. That's it. So, yeah.
Nice. Well, how did the experience of wearing so many hats on this project, or do you think it will change your relationship to collaboration on future films?
It wasn't different in the sense that, my first film was a documentary feature, and it was honestly me, a camera, some sound gear, and Burke, the photographer, and me just chasing him around for a year. And it was absolute madness. And I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. If you don't have to do it, don't. Because it is brutal, and it's also a blast and so much fun, but it is absolutely exhausting. So actually the narrative was much, much easier to do than that documentary, in that I did have some help in the form of my friends showing up, and they would, I'd frame things up and they would run the camera. They would essentially be assistant camera, they would hit record, make sure everything was in focus, when I would get things framed up. And I did have help, a lot of really great folks like Kyle, the producer on the film, another producer. He's a prop master and a set dresser and special effects master, and did all of these things. So I had really wonderful, talented friends that came in to help with this film. So I wasn't by myself on this film, although it was sometimes we had just me and the actors. Sometimes we had a crew of 2, sometimes we had a crew of 5, and one time we had a crew of 8 just for one day, which was amazing. But all my friends showed up to help and to run sound. And, you see in the credits all these names that keep repeating over and over and over again, because everybody was, running around doing different things. So, that was very, very helpful. But, taking on all those things is nuts. I absolutely loved it. But it's also really nice to have a crew to work with. I worked with crews, with music videos and lots of other things. And it's, you understand why people have big crews and why budgets, get so big so quickly because of what they're doing when you run around, doing all these things. But at the same time, I have zero complaints. I had so much fun making this film with a group of my oldest friends. It's that cliche that everybody says, where it's like, oh, you got a camera in your pocket. You got a camera and a group of friends. Go make your film. And everybody says that over and over and over again. And but it's true. Like, that's what happened on this film. I called my friends up. I said, I've got this script. I'm making this film, hell or high water. It's going to happen. It's going to get made, and it's going out in the world. And everybody was like, I'm in, count me in. And they have kids. They have full-time jobs. They took off work. They took in vacation to jump in and help me make this film. And what more is there than making a feature film with your friends? If you're a filmmaker, that's the dream.
Yeah. Nice. Well, Renato Casaro, I hope I'm not butchering his name.
No, you got it. You got it.
The man who painted the posters for Conan the Barbarian, and for a few dollars more, hand-painted your movie poster. Mm-hmm. So what specific nostalgic or pulp expectation were you trying to plant in the viewer's mind before they ever sat down in the theater?
Amazing question. Renato Casaro is my and many other people favorite movie poster artist of all time. He's just an amazing artist in general. His paintings are extraordinary, and rest in peace. He passed away not that long ago, but I just grew up loving his work. Army of Darkness, Conan the Barbarian, Never Ending Story, for a few dollars more, all of those Sergio Leone, spaghetti Western poster, and the list is endless. And so growing up looking at those, as we all do, I just admired them so much. And I thought, what a magical thing, because you look at that poster and it makes you want to go see the movie. You see his artwork and it's so beautiful and so magical. And you just immediately there. Yeah, that Conan poster is so great. The Army of Darkness poster is also one of my favorites. I mean, what's better than that? That's just extraordinary. So you immediately just say, I need to go see this movie and I want to hang that poster on my wall. And so that's the thing is the film is filled with, Spanish guitar, flamenco style guitar and whistling, in the score, similar to those, spaghetti Westerns and, Running Man. That's a good one. He did so many. I mean, it's endless. When I got deep into it, I just realized that he'd done all my favorites. And so the film has all those things. I just kind of thought it would be a perfect marriage, with the spaghetti Western style soundtrack, with a kind of being this psychedelic neo-Western thriller, horror, mystery, comedy, whatever you want to call it. It's been called so many different things. I just thought there couldn't be a more perfect, poster artist or a more perfect tie-in than Renato, or Mr. Casaro, I should say. And I was delighted when I got in touch with him that he wanted to paint the poster. It was just, another one of those moments that you frame up on the email you frame on your wall. It's one of those one of those moments.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of dry humor in the film, and one of the parts my wife and I laughed at the most was the Confederate reenactors. And they introduce a very specific ghost of American history into the story, regardless of, their lines that kind of get a giggle out of you. How do those characters function as a mirror to Stoner's own internal battle with his past?
The Confederate reenactors, for me, at first were a gag. I thought it would be funny. There's so many things in this film. I just thought it would be humorous or it would be terrifying. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, like you said, it is this kind of historical marker of where we were, in the 1800s and what happened to this country as it tore itself apart over slavery and different ideologies, and the more important those characters became. But I didn't want them to be taken too seriously because they are just silly, they're just total goofballs. And I put them both in Confederate outfits to make a statement, obviously. But I will say, they do mirror Stoner's, the paradox of his mind, because he's so spiritual and religious and he thinks he's hearing voices from God, and he's got this kind of humanistic quality to him that he's battling. And he's got some mission he thinks he needs to be on. And one of the Confederates is obviously a really nice guy who got roped into the whole cosplaying, a Confederate by his D&D buddies, and one of them is just a total jackass who is in the game because his parents were reenactors and he completely believes in the Confederacy and all of that other madness.
It's funny to think of Confederate reenactment as cosplay. You know what I mean?
And I'm sure there's a few people that will be absolutely offended by me saying that, who are reenactors, and my apologies to you for saying it that way. But I will say I've been to Civil War reenactments to do my homework for this movie. And I was very intrigued because I went into it as a very judgmental person thinking, oh, this is just cosplay. Look at all these folks in this giant battle. What are they doing? Even though I'm very entertained by it, and I love going to watch LARPers battle it out, with their foam swords. I think that stuff's so much fun. But I went into it with a judgmental attitude of, wow, look at this. What are we doing? Why are we reenacting this war? And what I came to find out, and I interviewed a bunch of the people from both camps, the Union and the Confederates, what I came to find out is in the movie. And it is true that a lot of them actually have both uniforms, and they will go, and they all know each other because they've been doing this forever. So they go to all these different battles, and one day you're a Confederate, the next day you're a Union soldier, and you go and you do your thing. But what it's really about for most of them, I won't say all, most of them is the community that they've built, the same way that they go, that the people at Comic-Cons and the cosplayers and the LARPers of the world have built their community on what they like to do. These people are very much into history and into American history, and they go there, and they've been doing this for 30, 40 years, some of them, and they meet up with their old friends, several times a year, and they get in costume, and they live in tents, and they cook on open wood fires in giant pots, and it was kind of magical. I was like, you know what? If my dad had raised me, as a Civil War reenactor rather than a competitive speedster, I would probably be doing that, Yeah. And so it checked me in my, my prejudgment going into something like that, where I was like, wow, okay, I didn't have this figured out. These folks they have very different, reasons for being here than I thought. Not all of them. There's some folks that are there just to get dressed up as Confederates and the South will rise again. But most of them that I met were just like, we just love the community and we love hanging out and we love doing this. And I was, you can't hate on anyone for that.
Yeah. So did you meet some people that kind of like that one soldier found their way into it from playing, RPG games?
Yes. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I met a guy who's a super sweet guy, part of the LGBTQ community. And he was, there, big beard, would have never, he just came up and we were chatting, and immediately, I saw in his tent, he had a rainbow flag, and I was like, this is so interesting. What a world. I'm in a Confederate, or not a Confederate, I'm in a Civil War reenacting camp. And here's this guy who wants to come up and chat about movies. And because I was filming some of it as well, I filmed the interviews, and we were just chatting, and that's where I got, he started introducing me to everybody on the Union side and the Confederate side and all his friends. And I was just like, this is such an interesting thing that I would have never guessed. As a very judgmental person from the outside, I would have never guessed that this was the reality on the inside, And so he walked me through it. He's, was a big gamer, big, a Comic-Con person, but there was also a retired FBI guy there, lots of retired law enforcement. There were lots of women. It was very interesting place to go.
Interesting. Well, the cable guy seems to exist in a completely different register than the spiritual chaos surrounding him. Why was it important to puncture that metaphysical dread with something as mundane as cable installation?
I wanted a very everyman character to balance out Stoner's madness, and for people to relate with, because it's hard to relate with the main character. It's very hard to relate with someone in that state. But Joel Lofton, one of my friends since I was 13, who's Joel in the film, is actually a cable installer.
Really?
Yeah. So he pulled up with his van, wore his belt with his tools, and is also just fantastic. He's this, and he's actually singing. That's him singing those gospel songs. He's very religious, a beautiful human being. He's been, he was always singing in his choir, still sings all the time. And I just knew that had to be part of the film, to get him to sing some gospel songs along with Margarita Crank, who is the neighbor who comes over and sings with him. But it just seemed to be too perfect. When I looked at Joel and I was like, you're going to play Joel in the movie. And I was like, also, you actually do install cable. He was working for Spectrum at the time, and now he's doing high-end home entertainment installations. So he runs cable and does that. And it just was this perfect balance of the everyman, blue collar guy who is the kind-hearted friend who, if you broke down in Alaska and you call Joel in real life, Joel will be like, I'll be there. It'll take me, 74 hours, but he'll be on the road instantly, So I knew that he would be able to play that character perfectly, because that actually is who Joel is. He comes into every situation just kind of like super nice. And, he's looking at this guy in camo makeup and he's like, okay, been a while since we've seen each other. Let me feel this out and see how it goes. But that's how Joel got cast.
Gotcha. Well, I spent 25 years in emergency medical services, and one thing that world taught me is that humor is often the only survival mechanism available when trauma gets really unbearable. So how did you adjust the dark comedy in this film so it illuminates Stoner's pain rather than mocking it?
Well, thank you for your service to this country and your profession, because that's a very important role, first off. Secondly, to the dark comedy in the film was just a given. Every script that I won't say every, there is a new script I've written that's being shopped around that doesn't have a lot of comedy in it. It's just really dark. But most everything that I really gravitate towards and that I write will have humor in it, and needs to have humor in it, no matter how dark and how terrifying. I just think that for this specific kind of film, I don't think it would hold an audience, and I don't think it would work to make this film as a straightforward, just action film, or just a horror film, or just a thriller or a mystery that just paces along and does its thing. I think that's not that interesting for this story. There's a lot of films that are straightforward, that are in those genres, that are brilliant. But for this story specifically, I think in order for it to have the pacing that it has and for it to work and to hold audiences, you needed to have that ultimate dread and terror. And then you also need to have that levity to bring you back, to make you chuckle and make you laugh. And that pacing, that wave of the humor, and then the darkness, and then the humor, and then the darkness, I thought would be, essentially what would carry the film. So that was always a goal from the very first draft.
So from what I understand, you're developing Odysseus in America, about Vietnam veterans and PTSD. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's about 3 or 4 films that are cooking right now, as it usually is in the independent world. That's one of them. That one, as my dad is a Vietnam veteran, is a very important story for me. And my friend Tom Chandler, who was one of the producers on Gunfighter, his father was a World War II veteran and a tank commander at 19. And he only passed away, I think it was 2 years ago, in his 90s. And I was trying my best to get down to Austin, Texas to interview him before he passed, but it didn't work. But my good friend Sharon, who works at Elizabeth City College, in North Carolina, her family are all Black veterans, and but several of her uncles and her father, were all served in Vietnam, and she built her whole PhD around the story of veterans who came back, and their stories of what happened once they came back to the United States. So I teamed up with her and Tom, and that film might change titles now that Christopher Nolan is coming out with his film. We might have to come up with a different title, but the title is derived from a really amazing book called Odysseus in America, written by a counselor for folks with PTSD. Just a brilliant book, and it's required reading for military now. But that film explores what happens there's a million films about Vietnam and about Iraq and Afghanistan and all those things that happen. This film is about what happens once those veterans return home and how they're treated in the United States. Because I have a lot of experience with how my father was treated, and it's not pretty. There's a whole story that I don't need to get into, but I went to battle with the VA to get him proper treatment for a heart condition, and it was a story. And they finally capitulated, and he got to go to Duke, and they paid for it. And it was that's a whole long story I won't get into, but that was one of the main reasonings behind doing this film. Was I realized that this is really important, and a lot of people aren't talking about it. And I have a lot of friends who are veterans as well, and talking to them, we realized how important that story is to tell. But there's several other films that I'm working on right now that one is going into post-production this summer.
So it's focused on what happened to him when he got back. Is there anything exploring the systems that sent him there?
Yes, those are very much explored. And the thing is my father was not drafted; he volunteered. Oh, okay. But there are a lot of people who were drafted. Sharon's family were all drafted, and their stories are included as well. But my father went to Vietnam with the idea he's serving his country, he's doing the right thing, he's doing what his uncles and his relatives did in World War II, and going and defending democracy and helping people. And he was 17 when he signed up, and he got back when he was 19, and it's a tragedy what happened,
Yeah, like how anybody could scapegoat the soldiers over the politicians,
Yeah. And that's what happened. And it's such a tragedy, because I understand why people it was a turning point in America, and why it was so divisive, understandably. But to make it about the soldiers that were just doing what they were either drafted or signed up to do, which is defend the country, and to be spit upon and called baby killers, which my dad was, when he came home in his uniform, it fundamentally damaged his generation forever. That's why they never talked about it until recently, is because they were villainized, whereas every American war veteran before was made a hero when they came home. There couldn't be a bigger difference between the World War II veterans as the ultimate heroes coming home and Vietnam veterans coming home and being villainized. And it's a real tragedy.
Hmm. Well, you worked as a colorist on Desperate Souls, Dark City, and The Legend of Midnight Cowboy, which was actually shortlisted for an Academy Award. What did working in that invisible role teach you about the architecture of tone and mood that directing your own material had not?
What's interesting about that is that I was making Gunfighter simultaneously to coloring that film.
Oh.
And Nancy Bursky, who directed that film, was a really, really good friend of mine, and is the executive producer of Gunfighter Paradise, actually. Actually, I'll tilt my camera. This is Nancy Bursky's painting, because before she was an acclaimed filmmaker, she was a painter. Nancy, she made By Sidney Lumet. She made the Midnight Cowboy documentary. She made The Rape of Reese Taylor. She co-wrote Loving, the narrative feature that Jeff Nichols directed. She co-wrote that with Jeff Nichols. and was the producer on that. And she just had this absolutely acclaimed career. She founded Full Frame Documentary Festival in Durham, North Carolina. And so Nancy and I met because of my first film. And she did the Q&A for my first doc, and we realized we lived 20 blocks from each other on the east side of New York. And she just kind of took me under her wing and took me to all the Academy screenings and BAFTA screenings, introduced me to everybody in New York, and just immediately said, "Hey, we got to collaborate on everything." So we became really close collaborators, and that's how she ended up executive producing Gunfighter. And she asked me, I love all, I see that you colored all the things that you've done. Will you come color this film for me? I said, sure. So I went in to their post-production facility here in New York, and Nancy and I sat there and worked for the film and colored it. And it was a magical time, because Nancy was a special talent, and we all miss her. She passed away in late 2023.
Well, so you have experience with music videos, which have a very specific instinct for rhythm, image, and emotional compression. What did working in that form teach you about how much mood and tone can carry before a single word of dialogue is even spoken?
I love this question. This is my favorite question about music. Truly, because movies, of course, I think are everybody's first love, because that's what you do as a kid, is you watch movies, and you're watching The Princess Bride and Rambo, and you're taken to this different world. But my father gave me a classical guitar and taught me a few little things on this little classical guitar. So I grew up playing guitar, and then I moved to piano and tried all kinds of things. But I've been playing music my whole life, and once you get into the music studio and you start learning rhythm and you start learning collaboration in that way, it's a certain language, a kind of unspoken language that translates really well to if you get into film. It's a great way to get into film, thinking about editing specifically. So a lot of advice that I give students and other filmmakers is if they can edit, and they do edit, is to do it as much as possible and use music and learn how to work with music, because it will help you work with composers. It will help you figure out your film before you go shoot it. It will help you so much to be able to edit and know what works and what doesn't, and how a film needs a rhythm, just like a song does. It really needs beats and rhythms to hold, and they're invisible, and people don't know they're there, but they are there, and they're there for very intentional reasons. Just like a bridge is there in a song, and a verse is there in a song, and a chorus and a pre-chorus are there for very specific reasons to evoke these certain emotions as you go through that song. It's the exact same way in movies, And so if you can edit, which I did a lot of editing before I went out and made something that I presented to people as a finished product, as a movie. I edit all kinds of things, and I use music and everything to really, merge those two things. So music is very, very important to me, and rhythm is very, very important to me. And walking on set, whether it's a documentary, which is you're just kind of making up as you go, and filming things, you still need to be thinking about how this will cut together in the edit room. And so it's extremely helpful to be able to do that. And then on narrative, you kind of got to have it figured out, storyboarded, but things still change. But if you're there as a director thinking about how this is going to cut together, it is so extraordinarily helpful. And, Martin Scorsese, let's talk about Martin Scorsese. He's got Shoemaker, excuse me, as his longtime editor. And she's as genius as anybody, but Martin Scorsese is also a really good editor, and that's why his films are so good. He edited part of the Woodstock film. A lot of people don't know that he edited a major section in the Woodstock film, which is mind blowing when you find that out. And a lot of really great directors and writers in movies are really good editors. Look at David Fincher. There's no way that David Fincher isn't an editor. Come on.
Master.
Exactly. He's in the edit room just fine tuning every little thing. And because he knows what rhythm he wants, he knows how he wants things to land. And that's so important when it comes to music. Going back to your question about music, I have to talk just briefly about my musical partner on this film, Brian Black. Brian is one of my oldest friends. We played music together for years and years. He is a PhD scientist by day, and just happens to be great at sound design. and a great musician. And so when I composed the music for the film, I brought Brian on to co-write the music and to do the mixing and the mastering and the Foley and the sound design. And so he's a PhD scientist by day, and by night he's this strange Batman who is taking this movie and adding all these amazing pieces to it and co-writing the score with me and adding, he's an amazing drummer and multi-instrumentalist, and he added all this percussion to it. And so that was a really, really special thing, was to work with Brian on this film and have him to work on it. And I also have to give credit to my good friend Eric Slick, who covered this really, one of my favorite Iggy Pop songs for the opening. He covered that Iggy Pop song, and he's, Eric is everywhere. He drums for, everybody. He's a renowned musician. All you have to do is type in Eric Slick on Google and a million things pop up, and your mind will be blown at who Eric Slick is and who he plays with and his own records that are everywhere. I just called him up and I was just like, Nana, it's last minute. I need a cover of this Iggy Pop song for the opening of the film. And, he played every instrument, drums, guitar, bass, did all the vocals, sang all the harmonies, and in his studio in his house, and sent it right back to me. And it was the most perfect, spot on, beautiful cover. And it's not an easy thing to cover an Iggy Pop song. Mm-hmm. Iggy Pop is a special beast, and there is no attitude like Iggy Pop. And Eric knocked it out of the park. So I just wanted to briefly mention Brian Black, who did all of the sound design and Foley and mixing and mastering, and also was my co-writer for the score of the film, and Eric Slick for jumping in there and knocking those things out.
All right, shout out to Brian and Eric. Well, and actually, kind of a side note, I also I started playing drums when I was 6, and started playing guitar when I was like 12, I think, when Nirvana and the whole grunge thing started happening. It's like, oh, I got to play guitar now.
Yeah.
And I do book trailers for, novels, people's novels, and that's very much a song. You know what I mean?
That's so cool. What a cool gig to have. So you're working, doing the music and editing that together for those trailers?
Yeah, like I use stock music tracks, right? That have, they'll have something you can use as a bridge, something you can use as a drop, and you have to cut it up and piece it together and loop it here, and use stock video. And I do the voiceover, but, even with that, I'm, cutting my voice up, spacing it, time stretching it here, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you know the editing game, and then
yeah.
it is an art. It is well, obviously it's an art, but it is one of the most important art forms in our medium. It's so important. That's a really cool gig. I love that. Yeah, and going back to your Nirvana, one of the first songs a friend showed me on guitar was All Apologies, and I used to play that until my mom almost went insane. I would just keep playing that and keep playing it. And then when someone showed me Today by the Smashing Pumpkins, she was like, "Oh my goodness!" She was like, "Buddy, it sounds great, but just learn some other stuff."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's crazy is my 10-year-old niece has a vinyl collection. First song she learned to play on the guitar is Come As You Are, just like me. And the last time I came to see her, she showed up at the door with the old school black skull Misfits shirt. I was like, dude, this girl is living my life.
You can't be prouder than that.
Yeah.
Right? You cannot be prouder than that. My niece, Lulu, is amazing. She's just graduating high school. I consider her my daughter. She's my sister-in-law's daughter, but I would like to say that I've helped raise her, and be the cool uncle, but I consider her my daughter. Lulu is learning guitar right now, and we just went through oh my gosh, what's Enter Sandman.
Oh,
so
Metallica,
she was playing, she was playing Enter Sandman the other day, and then she came in and she's playing a Radiohead song, and I was just so proud. I was like, man, this generation and she's buying CDs, and I was so proud. You can't be more proud than when your kids are buying vinyls and playing rock and roll from the 90s,
Yeah, it seems, there's plenty of new pop music that I think is good, but if you're into rock, it's like everybody just falls back to the 90s. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know what contemporary rock is going on right now. Is it just not good? Everybody's gravitating.
I'm being on campus at UNC, so I love that students show up in it in like a t-shirt with John Carpenter's The Thing, or they show up in a Radiohead shirt, or they show up in a Soundgarden. Anytime somebody wears a Soundgarden shirt, I run up to them, I'm like, that is cool. And I feel so fortunate that our generation, you know, like being 13 years old and hearing Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins and in living color and all these things just, you know, were happening on the radio in real time. And, you know, we were hitting record on our cassettes to record it off the radio. I love that. I love that this generation has cycled back to that the same way that we cycled back to Led Zeppelin, and we cycled back to all those great rock, you know, it's Black Sabbath and all those things from, you know, the 1970s.
Yeah. Or even not even that far, just back to the, you know, you're like a teenager in the 90s, but just going back one decade to the 80s to the classic punk and all that.
Totally. Absolutely. Yep.
Well, just kind of like musical influences, you have some literary influences that range from Buñuel, and I always mess up the name, Kieslowski, I think, to Saramago and Pessoa. How do literary influences actually enter your scripts in a practical way beyond just admiration?
So when I'm writing, I'm really leaning into my favorite writers, and because they're my favorite thinkers, you know. And so people like José Saramago, who is a brilliant Portuguese writer, people like Machado de Assis, brilliant Brazilian writer, Fernando Pessoa, one of the wildest, most out there, incredibly gifted and incredibly insane writers to ever exist. And he was writing in the 20s and 30s as a poet, but also he was an essayist, and he put together this book. Well, there's this book called The Book of Disquiet, which is a collection of his works. Those things influence amongst so many other novelists and writers that I could name that everybody already knows. But those are names that not everyone knows. Those really, really deeply influenced me when I was going through college and getting into those. And I spent a lot of time in Portugal, making my first films and reading those books, and just the philosophies inside of them, and the magic realism and the darkness and the existential dread that's and the humor. There's always humor in all of those things. Those influenced me like nothing else, you know. Yes, the Coen brothers are a massive influence on me as a filmmaker, as they are on everybody, but it's more those writers from Brazil and Portugal that influenced me in the darkness of humor and the darkness of our existential life, and waking up at midnight realizing, oh, I'm going to die someday, and having to reckon with that, you know, every now and again. Those writers are who I really lean into more than filmmakers, truly, because, you know, it all starts with a script, and what's better than leaning into your literary heroes and than just watching a bunch of movies and saying, oh, I like that, I like to use that. You know, I'm leaning into my literary heroes more than I am my filmmaking heroes.
Gotcha. Well, you, I think, kind of alluded to it earlier. You said you had 3 films on the burner. One of which is in development about the first women executed for witchcraft in America, which was actually decades before Salem. So what pulled you toward that specific historical wound, and where did you come across the information? Because, I mean, I have to admit ignorance. I was like, I thought it was Salem. You know, it was like a flash in the pan, and then, you know, it was over.
I did too. I had no idea this was a thing. And it's a court documented thing that happened in Connecticut. And I got pulled into it because of Nancy Bursky. Here we go. We come right back to Nancy again. Nancy is a very, you know, she had she co-wrote and produced that movie Loving, with Ruth Negga and Joel Egerton, with Jeff Nichols directing. But that was her one foray into the scripted narrative world. And so she was really, in her career, was transitioning into narrative from documentary, because she is a very acclaimed documentarian. And so she was asked by these 2 wonderful people, Charles Tremaine and Caroline Grist, who have been the producers on true crime for years and years and years. A lot of true crime they've produced. They discovered this story and approached Nancy, would you like to direct this film? And Nancy immediately was like, yes, this is right up my alley. It's going to be scripted. We're going to attach talent. We're going to go for it. Nancy, I was making Gunfighter at the time. Nancy calls me and she goes, hey, will you co-write this script with me? and will you also be my cinematographer? And of course, how do you, like, you're not going to say no to that. And it's just like, absolutely, of course. So that's how I found out about it. And so Nancy and I were location scouting in Connecticut at all these places where things actually happened. And that's how I got roped into it. And so Nancy unfortunately passed away. I was getting the sound mixed and mastered with Brian Black. And I got a call from one of our other producers that Nancy had passed. And the producers and I talked, after Nancy's funeral, and talked about a lot of things, and decided, okay, we'd just gotten started working on our ideas about the film, but we hadn't put any pages down yet together, which is what we were planning to do the week I was getting back from mixing and mastering Gunfighter. And so I said, Nancy would want this film to go forward, I know for a fact. And so I went ahead and wrote the script. And Charles and Caroline, we went through a couple of drafts until we landed on something we really liked. And now they're shopping it around to different places and trying to get the right talent attached and get the film made. But that's how I found out about it. But it's really shocking. 40 years before the Salem witch trials, 11 people were killed and hung. And this is specifically about one person. And her name was Goodwife Nat. And so it was all a political scam, and it was all done by this guy named Roger Ludlow, who helped found Connecticut Colony, but was a very evil individual. And he helped massacre the Pequot Indian, the whole tribe of Pequot who were in Connecticut. He was responsible for their almost complete annihilation. And so he is the person who perpetrated these hangings based on the Witch Finder General's handbook from England. He got a hold of that and said, I'm going to use this. That way I can get rid of my political enemies in my town in Connecticut and accuse these people of witchcraft and kill them and get them out of the way. And he succeeded several times. And anyway, he was banished back to Ireland at some point once this trial came out and all the people came out with the facts of him accusing Goodwife Knapp of witchcraft and killing her and multiple other people for political reasons. But that's what the film is based on. That's one of the films in development.
Well, from filmmaking to teaching, you are now a professor at UNCSA teaching cinematography, which, I can't think of a better person based on what I've seen from the film. Do you think the way filmmaking gets taught actually prepares students for the emotional and financial realities of the work, or does it mostly shield them from those realities?
We are shifting into preparing students for the realities of now, and it's not an easy shift. It's a hard shift because a lot of people are very baked into the idea that film is just like it was 25 years ago, and it is not. It is a very different landscape. And I feel very fortunate to be doing what I'm doing with Gunfighter Paradise, with music videos and all of the different things, to be out in the world making these films and knowing exactly how it works right now, to be able to go back to my students and say, this is how, you go about doing certain things as an independent filmmaker. And if you get hooked up with a big contract and a giant agent with a studio, awesome. Give me a call and I'll tell you congratulations. If you don't, this is the path, and this is what's happening right now in the real world. So we are transitioning. UNC and lots of other schools that teach film are having to really buckle down and teach film as it is now, as opposed to the way that it's been for the last 120 years or whatever. Because it's just a very different landscape, and I'm glad to be able to help guide my students in that way, because they're all heading out on their own. Some are graduating this year, obviously, and to be able to try to give them as much advice as possible and put them in contact with as many people as I can that can help them along in their career is it's a challenge, but it's also very rewarding that I'm trying to prepare them as best as possible for the industry as it is right now. And thank you for that compliment about the cinematography and teaching it. I love teaching cinematography. I love teaching everything. Teaching at a film school is a very, very unique experience because the students aren't on their phones. They're wide-eyed and ready to go, and they want to have their hands on lights and cameras, and they're directing and shooting, and they're making 3 or 4 films a semester and running around and doing all of the jobs and learning it all. And they're just in a whirlwind of creativity, which is just so much fun to be a part of. It's like going to work every day, hanging out with a bunch of amazing young people who are just so fired up and creative, and watching them work and helping them try to figure it out. It's an honor, truly.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I'm actually an adjunct instructor now that I've retired from the EMS firefighting, and it's a really good feeling to just like to revert back to the beginning, to where you're working with people just coming in. There's no PTSD, there's no burnout, just being around young people, in middle age is really good for your mental health and just general well-being.
I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. It's a very special thing. It's a privilege. What are you teaching?
EMS, EMT, and paramedic.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting into, I guess, probably the more technical aspects of what you teach, you're in a bit of a war against motion smoothing. And I actually, I actually had to look that up. I didn't know what it was. So,
oh man, that's so great. That's so great. Oh man.
Are you not?
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely am.
Okay.
I'm just so delighted that you found that out.
Yeah.
And that landed somewhere, because I am absolutely in a war with motion smoothing. It's so true.
Can you kind of maybe briefly describe in layman's terms what it actually is, and, beyond the obvious technical damage it does to the image, what does it, I guess, say about how people have kind of gotten numb to, the actual texture of art?
Texture is the right word. Nailed it. It's the texture, and it's the filmmaker's intention. The best way I can describe it, and I'll get into the technicals of what it actually is, but what it essentially boils down to, the best metaphor that I've been able to come up with that people seem to like, is imagine you go to an art museum. Let's say we went to the Met. We go in, there's modern art, there's classic art, there's art from all over the place. And in front of every painting, the Met has decided to put up some strange piece of plastic that is somewhat holographic and that over sharpens every part of the image that was originally painted, changes the image and adds, all of this contrast and sharpness, and it does not look, all the things that are supposed to be soft are now extraordinarily sharp, and all the things that where there was a depth of field before, there's no longer a depth of field and it's all flat, right? So you go into this museum and they're like, hey, we've put this enhancing magic, piece of holographic plexiglass in front of every painting, and it's going to make your experience that much better. And there's no way we're not taking it off. And so every piece of art you're trying to go see Monet, or you're trying to go see Max Ernst, or you're trying to see, Dali, or any of these people, and you go and you don't see what they intended for you to see. You see what this institution, or in the TV industry, these tech corporations have decided that you should see as a default setting. And you hate it, because you've seen in magazines and pictures how beautiful that art is. And instead you're getting this weird version of it that looks like you're looking at it through the eyes of Predator, some strangely enhanced thing, right? So what motion smoothing is, and this is the most frustrating part, is every TV manufacturer has decided to call it something different. So like on LG, it's True Motion. On, Sony, it's called something else, Clear Motion or Clarity or whatever. But it's all comes down to to motion smoothing. And you've seen Christopher McQuarrie and Tom Cruise lobby against this. Every year they repost that commercial where Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie are like, please everyone, turn off the motion smoothing on your television so that
it's
you're
optional?
not yeah, on some TVs, but the problem is some other manufacturers have turned it on permanently to where you can't turn it off. Which for me just makes me, I'm just like, I'll destroy this TV. And I have actually twice I have gone and bought TVs for my good friends who have bought the cheap version of a big flat screen that has motion smoothing turned on permanently and they can't turn it off, because I'm like, no, you can't watch movies that way, because it's absolutely not what the filmmaker, it doesn't look like Apocalypse Now. It doesn't look like Godfather. It looks, and backing up a bit, motion smoothing is also called the soap opera effect for good reason, because what it does is it takes a normal frame rate and it turns it into a higher frame rate to where it looks like a television soap opera shot at 30 frames a second, which is very different than the standard cinema 24 frames a second, right? What motion smoothing is doing is it's a program, algorithm, whatever you want to call it, that takes the movie and it adds all these frames that don't exist. So if it's shot in 24 frames a second, which is what all cinema is shot in, most cinema, it adds all of these other frames in between to where it'll rack it up to 30 frames a second or 60 frames. But those aren't real frames. And what that does is it sharpens all of the lines on all the people. It takes all the CGI that was matted in by the CGI artist, brings it up front, makes it look like absolute trash. It changes the lighting. It over sharpens all of the lighting. So the entire look of the film is completely changed to look like absolute garbage. I'm not saying soap operas are garbage. I'm just saying the way they're shot is garbage. It's just shot like you're on some set, on a soap opera, and it turns epic, amazing movies into this just absolute garbage on screen. And so what I do is if I'm at relatives' houses or hotels or bars, my wife got on me one time because I was at a restaurant and I asked for the remote control to turn off their motion smoothing on the TV they had because I hate it so much because like my stomach drops when I see a classic film with motion smoothing all over it, and it just looks so bad. And if you put up a TV with motion smoothing on versus a TV without it, sometimes it's hard to spot. Some people they've gotten so used to it because they got their TV and they turned it on. They're like, oh, it's just super sharp because it's all HDR and it's 8K monitor, so it's supposed to look like this. No. Anything shot in 8K or 12K or 24K at that resolution still looks like classic cinema. If it's shot in 24 frames, it still looks amazing if it's lit correctly. But as soon as you turn motion smoothing on, it's just it destroys it.
So is it just duplicating frames?
Yes, it is duplicating frames and inserting them in between each actual real frame. And what it's good for, the reason they did it is for sports, because it hyper sharpens sports, right? Because what it's trying to do is sharpen every image to the absolute maximum. And there's no
motion. You can tell if their foot was over the line and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And there's no blurring. And so there's natural blurring in real life. Like your hand, things will actually blur a little bit, like the way that light works. And there's in film in 24 frames, if something's moving really fast, there'll be some motion blurring. And that's what we're used to seeing. And it gives it kind of this magical cinema look. And motion smoothing eliminates every bit of blur, that's happening as something's moving. And so that they wanted sports to look really sharp and everybody that's running for there to be no blurring at all. And it's also great for some video games because it hyper sharpens everything. So video games and sports, it's fantastic for, right? But they, instead of making it an option for you to turn on for sports and video games, all TVs come with it turned on automatically. And so you have to go figure it out, find out where it is, turn it off. Sometimes, and if you unplug your TV and plug it back in, it's turned back on again. So you have to go back and turn it off. And it's madness.
Well, all right. Well, I know you are a busy man, busy creator. So last question. What is the life of Jethro Waters like outside of filmmaking and writing?
Wow. Never gotten that question in an interview. Very good. I have no complaints, to be honest. I mean, I know the world is upside down right now and there's a lot of chaos and violence and terrible stuff happening. I have a lot of friends who are colleagues who are in the Middle East and all over the Middle East, and so that, I feel for them. It's tragic what's going on. But the life, my life as it is right now, I have no complaints. My family's healthy. I spend a lot of time playing music because it's just a great meditation and a great way to spend time if I'm not writing. I spend a lot of time just hanging out with my wife, watching movies, going to the movies, going to the Met, walking, that's trying to stay calm in a world of chaos. That's my main goal, and to spend as much time with my family as I can. That's it's pretty chill. There's not a lot of chaos or anything really exciting to talk about other than just I watch a lot of movies, read a lot of books, hang out with my wife, goof off and walk around. There's one really fun thing is that Gunfighter Paradise is getting a graphic novel treatment. So we're turning the story into a series of graphic novels that will be 4 post film and 4 before the film happened. And so building a whole mythology around the story. Won't give away any details on the artist or where it's coming out, but the artist is absolutely extraordinary, and has made a lot of graphic novels in the past. And so we've been working together on that. But as soon as I have actual dates, times, publishers, all of that, I will send you a note to let you know when that's coming out. And anybody that wants to know about that our website will have all that information later on in the year.
Sweet. Sounds good. Well, Jethro, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Vince, it's been a pleasure to be here on the Dark Mind podcast, and thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug, reiterate, or let your viewers know about?
Sure. So anybody who wants to find out more about Gunfighter Paradise or to find out where to watch it, gunfightermovie.com is the place to go. And we have a lot of theaters coming up that aren't posted yet, but North Carolina will be first, and then it'll be Chicago, and then it'll be all over the country. We're going to be touring this film across the country throughout summer, and then we'll be updating with streaming services later on in the year. So that will all be on the website. There's a newsletter that you can sign up for if you'd like to be updated on to what's going on. And yes, and there's also another film that's going into post-production called The Hitmaker, Bernard Purdie, which I'm directing, and that is about an extremely famous drummer who is 86 and still drumming away all over the world. And there's a famous drum beat called the Purdie Shuffle, and Bernard Purdie invented that and was the band leader for Aretha Franklin, and has played for on all the records we all know, from Steely Dan to James Brown to just everything from 1963 until now. So he's my good friend Ralph Roll, who is the drummer for Chic and Nile Rodgers, is producing that film with me, and that will go into post-production, and hopefully we'll have it out next year.
Right. That's plenty to keep us busy.
It's a lot, but it's fun.
All righty. Well, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Jethro, thank you again for joining me.
Vince, thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.